Pokémon moves are categorized into 3 different pools. Physical, which calculates damage using the user's attack stat and the receiver's defense stat. Special, which is the same but with special stats. And status moves, which do not directly deal damage. For the first 3 generations of the games, which category a damage-dealing move fit into was determined by the type of move that it was. Normal type moves were always physical, fire were always special, and so on and so forth. At no point in any of the first 3 generations is this explained to the player, nor are the type categorizations stated at any point. After over a decade of confusing children with obtuse game mechanics, the brain trust at Game Freak decided to make it slightly less opaque and actually logically categorize moves individually rather than doing it by type. This meant that elemental punching moves like Fire Punch would now be physical moves, as would moves like Bite and Crunch, which until that point had been special moves, despite being called Bite and Crunch. Yes, you could think of the evolutions plus Dragon to remember which moves are special, but Game Freak could have also fixed their games sooner. I spent several Gen 3 playthroughs running Special Sharpedo, which certainly wasn't bad, but there was really no reason to teach Ice Beam to a shark. There are still some logical inconsistencies to this point. Most rock-type moves are variations of throwing rocks at the other Pokémon, but for some reason Ancient Power throws rocks at other Pokémon in a way that's prehistoric, and therefore it's a special move. But I digress. Game Freak did make a good change, one that I absolutely loved even as a child, and think vastly improved the mechanics and operation of the games. But I realized recently that the first 3 generations bedded in the type category association in a way that lingers to this day. I still assume that if there's a fighting type on screen, it's going to be using mostly physical moves, and vice versa for psychics and special moves. The habit of making each move type tied to physical or special damage has lingered in the types of moves that Pokémon tend to use. I suspected that the assumptions have persisted more than most people realize, and I wanted to know if that was in fact true. To get started, I opened a spreadsheet and copied and pasted move data into the fields, excluding status moves, which for my purposes are irrelevant, and Z moves, which do not themselves fit into the category of physical or special, but are instead based off the original move. Then I simply filtered for each move type and recorded how many physical and special moves each type had for all 18 types. This thankfully didn't take very long and gave me a nice looking graph and set of numbers that I can now share with you all. For the headline figure, of the 18 types, 8 of those types have a significant majority of moves that align with their pre-Generation 4 move category. For example, 83% of damage-dealing Psychic type moves are special moves. So we could say that while there are now physical Psychic type moves, they are in the vast minority, and the pool of offensive Psychic types that mostly use physical attack is relatively small. There are some, yes, but they're mostly legendaries or pseudo-legendaries, which are all grouped together because of their overall high base stat total, which feels like more of an overriding consideration. They're also mostly capable of running as mixed attackers as well, so it kind of makes the point of Psychic moves being mostly special moot. On the reverse, fighting types are almost the polar opposite. There are 46 damage-dealing fighting type moves, and a higher proportion of these are physical than Psychics are special, at 89% physical. These 2 examples align with what I'd expected before crunching the numbers. To me, fighting typifies the physical category. I am going to physically punch you, and Psychic typifies the special. I am going to damage you in a way other than using direct physical force. They are the extremes at either end of the spectrum. No other types have such an imbalance of physical and special moves. So let's take a look at the others to see where the medians and the like fall. Though no types have a perfect balance, multiple of them come close, with the balance not tipping either side of 60% physical or special. Electric is 58% special, Dragon is 56% special, Poison is 52% special, which I found notable, by the way, given it was a physical type pre-Generation 4. Ice is 54% physical, and grass is 56% physical. It's worth mentioning now an important factor that weighs on this whole dataset. Each type does not have an even number of damage-dealing moves. At the extremes, Bug and Poison have 21 damage-dealing moves apiece, and Rock has even fewer at 18. Fairy has 14, but that feels more acceptable since it was only introduced in Generation 6. At the other end, normal types have 96 damage-dealing moves, which makes sense to me given Normal's role as the generalist default kind of type in the game. This also explains why Poison goes from purely physical to a slight special tilt as of now. There just aren't that many Poison type moves overall, so recategorizing all of the Poison type moves that should have always been special results in a balance of 10 to 11, rather than Normal's split of 72 physical moves to 24 special moves. There is one odd type out in this dataset, and that's Dark types. Dark types went from being a special type pre-Generation 4 to being one of the most overwhelmingly physical types, second only to fighting. 82% of Dark type moves are physical, which feels like more of a correction than a swing towards something different. I think that Dark types should have always been physical, even pre-Generation 4. Moves like Bite, Crunch, and Thief being special were very responsible for making the pre-Generation 4 split so confusing to younger players. Why on earth would biting another Pokemon deal special damage? Dark should have always been physical, but I guess that didn't mesh with the early Dark-type staples like Umbreon being a defensive wall. To come to the point of why does this matter? It's a fair question, and one I will modestly attempt to answer. For a long time, I've liked the idea that Pokemon has been moving towards a more balanced game, where if the player, for whatever reason, wanted to run an all-special attacking team made up of their favourite types, which for argument's sake included physically inclined types like Rock and Normal, they would be able to do so while taking advantage of special stab moves for those Pokemon. You could have normal types like Slacking using Hyper Voice and Uproar, and Cradily with Ancient Power. Your whole team could be set up this way, and you would have options for stab moves to use and Pokemon to match. What this data shows me is that it hasn't really panned out this way. Barring Lucario with Aura Sphere and Focus Blast, you would struggle to find other options for special attacking fighting types. Not that it matters, having one option out of dozens of fighting types is a condemnation on its own. The same goes for Rock and Dark. There just aren't options if you wanted to build special sets with these types and also have a variety of options for damage dealing moves. I mentioned Cradily earlier, but the only special Rock type move that it gets is Ancient Power. It cannot get Power Gem, and there are only 4 special Rock type damage dealing moves anyway. Like I said, I've wanted for a long time for each type to be more like Poison types, a rough balance of special and physical moves, so that if your favourite Pokemon happen to be that type, you have options for decent damage dealing stab moves for your style of gameplay. Part of why I wanted this type of situation to eventuate is because up until Generation 4, some types suffered severely with just no good damage dealing moves at all. Only an elite set of types had access to really high-powered moves like Blizzard or Fire Blast. But for Ghosts, Shadow Ball was the best you could do. Rock types had their infamous accuracy problem, but they also lacked any real high-power moves. Dragon types like Flygon suffered because they couldn't utilize their higher attack stat with only special dragon moves, and didn't get the higher power Outrage to compensate. Generation 4 made some solid attempts to rectify this by introducing a lot of new higher power moves for previously underserved types, but didn't really get all the way to solving this problem. Having said all of that, I can also see a genuine argument for types being typecast into being mostly physical or special attackers. I come back again to fighting or psychic types. It's a hard case to make that both of these types should be equally balanced as physical and special attackers, because their inclination towards one or the other is inherent to their types. Fighting types physically punching and kicking other Pokemon is what makes them fighting types. So I can see that for some people, an 80-20 balance of moves for some types is probably just fine, and they wouldn't see the need for more special fighting type moves. Besides, Focus Mist has been doing a bang-up job to date. On the question of whether or not the split has actually been fixed, the answer is a middling sort of yes, sort of no. Just over a third of types have what I would consider a reasonable balance of physical and special moves, between 40 and 60% of either of them. The rest are tilted so heavily in one direction that you can still just call them physical or special types in my view, with a few notable exceptions for each amongst the 1,000 Pokemon that currently exist. It would probably be more accurate to say that Pokemon made the split make a bit more sense, but hardly balanced it out to the point where there are no longer types that can be considered dominantly physical or special. There's a last point to make here, and that's that some types are just genuinely neglected, like poison and bug types who have very few moves, very few high base stat total Pokemon, and very few options for building different sets. It almost doesn't matter what their balance of moves is because they've just been ignored since Generation 1, and that's hardly looking like changing anytime soon. This is a point I raised more broadly in another video on the types that Game Freak hates, so check that out if you want to hear more. That's all I had, folks. Is there a type that you think could use some more physical special move redistribution in Generation 10? Did I miss something notable about the data that I used here? As always, the spreadsheet and table is linked in the description. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe, it helps the channel out a bunch. I've also been speedrunning a lot lately over on Twitch, so follow me there if you want to chat between videos. Thanks for watching, see you next time.